Alright, you can see that I'm playing normally, but after a while, here is our NPC, and it's gonna start a dialogue. We can touch to continue, and when it ends, it goes right past us, and after a while, the entity starts spawning again. Perfect. Hi, I'm Ricky. Today we're on the 28th episode of the Endless Runner series, and today we see how to make a simple NPC system. We see how to spawn an NPC and pause the game while doing it, show some dialogue to the player, and then resume play. Now this looks really simple, but if we want to make our dialogues customizable and be able to spawn as many NPCs as we want, then we need a good foundation, and that's what we're gonna do. Alright, so let's start by actually making the NPC. In my case, I'm simply gonna duplicate the player and remove all the player components, flip it on the Z, and here's our NPC. Now we also want to change the rigid body to D. We want to freeze it on the X, but not on the Y. And we also want to freeze the rotation. And in the box collider, we want to set it to its trigger. And because we want to detect when the NPC has reached the player, we want the collider to be as wide as the screen. By setting an offset on the Y, we also give a bit of space between the NPC and the player when they talk. Alright, I'm gonna move this here, rename it. I'm also gonna move it up here, outside of the screen. And let's see, let's go to 6 on the Y. I'm also gonna save this. And now let's make and add a new component called NPC. In here, we want to hold a value for the starting point of our NPC, a value for the speed, and a reference to the rigid body. Alright, and back to Unity. I'm gonna put 6 at the starting point for the Y, and I've put 3 as the default value for speed. Now let's also disable the game object by default, and now back in the script, we want the NPC to be in one of 3 states. We want to activate the NPC, we want to initialize the dialogue with the player, and finally we want to disable the NPC. So let's start with activate NPC. We do that by turning on the game object, setting a speed on the rigid body, and changing the position of our transform position. And make sure you're using a minus before the speed to actually go down the Y coordinates. Alright, so next step is detecting the player. So let's do that in the onTriggerEnterToD function. If we collide with the player, then we want to start the dialogue. I'm just gonna leave a comment here for now, we'll worry about that later. Finally, we want to disable the NPC, which means simply turning the game object to false. And we're gonna do that when we reach the finish line. So let's go back to Unity. Here, the finish line is the hitbox that the NPC has to touch before it turns off. So let's go in the finish line script. And in here, let's add a statement to search for the NPC tag. And we also get the NPC component and call that function. Now back to Unity, let's add the NPC tag to the NPC. And if you haven't already, put the player tag to BoatPlayer. Also, because the hitbox of the NPC is really big, and it's also a bit forward, it's gonna touch the finish line before it's actually off the camera screen. So let's add a delay to the disable NPC function. We're gonna add some functionality here later on. To handle the dialogue logic, we don't wanna do that in the NPC, we want a class that manages all NPCs. So let's go back to Unity, and in the game manager, let's go ahead and make a new component called NPC Manager. In here, we want a reference to the NPC that we want to activate, and normally we could use a singleton, but you may want to make different NPCs in the future. So for now, let's just make a serialized field reference. Now let's make a function to activate the NPC. And when we do that, the NPC is gonna start traveling towards the player, but in the meantime, we don't want the obstacles to spawn. So let's call the spawn manager. And here we want to change the can spawn value to false, but right now it's private. So instead of changing this value to public, I say we just make a new function just for it to make it safer. Alright, back to the NPC manager. Let's call that new function. And now the NPC is going to travel to the player. Good. Now let's make a function to actually start the dialogue. Starting a dialogue basically means opening up a dialog box and changing a dialog text. So let's make a reference for both of these things. Let's activate the dialog box, which will also hold the dialog box text, so we don't have to turn that on too. And while the NPC talks to the player, we also want the NPC to stop. So let's just change the timescale to 0. Let's make a new function called loadNextDialogText. We also call it, and in here we're gonna cycle through the current dialogue, and if we still have some strings left, then we change the dialog box text, otherwise we end the dialogue. So let's also make an end dialog function. When we end the dialogue, we want to basically revert these values. And that's it for this function. Now for the loadNextDialogText, as you can see it's public because we're also gonna call it in-game by touching the dialog box. So before we go any further, let's go to Unity and actually make the UI. I'm gonna hide the shop panel real quick, and in the game panel, I'm gonna make a new panel. Alright, then in the dialog box, I'm also gonna add a button component. And as the function, I'm gonna drag in the game manager, NPC manager, load next dialog text. Then by default, we set this to false, and we bring in the references in here. And let's also bring the NPC reference while we're at it. Great. Let's turn on the shop panel back on. Now we just need an actual dialog to show. The best way to do that is to use scriptable objects. So let's make a new class. I've called it SNPC dialog, where the S stands for scriptable object. And remember to always use the system serializable and create asset menu attributes when you are making a scriptable object. In here, we don't want to do any crazy things just yet, simply an array of strings containing all the text of a certain dialog. And because we're gonna fill these dialog lines in the inspector, it's better if you also add the text area attribute. Finally, we also want a function returning us a certain dialog line rather than another. As you can see, I've made it a Boolean value because I want this function to return true if we have a dialog line available, false if we have reached the end of the dialog, while the actual string we're gonna pass in as an out parameter. Finally, we also need a way to check which index of the array to look at. We could just add a value in here, an integer, which we then increase each time to return a certain line rather than another. But you should never write on a scriptable object, only read from it. Scriptable objects behave differently from the editor and the actual game when it's built. Long story short, use scriptable objects to read data only. So to get to the next line, let's just ask for another parameter. Now in here, we check whether the index is equal to the length of the dialog lines array. And if it's so, it means that we have already ended the dialog, so we return false. And before we return the value, we also have to fill in the out value, so we set dialog line to null. But if we do have some dialog line left, then we out the value based on the array given this index, and we return true. Now in the NPC manager, given a certain dialog, we want to call that function. So first, let's make a reference to a dialog. And let's also make an int to hold the current index. Then, in our loadNextDialogText, we simply call the current dialog. If you are successful, then we set the dialog text to dialog line. And we also increase the current dialog index by 1. If you are unsuccessful, we reset the current dialog index and we end the dialog. Finally, let's make a singleton of NPC manager. And let's go to NPC and replace this comment with the NPC manager's dialog start. Also, while we're here, if you remember, we have turned off the spawning system, so we need to turn it back on, and we're gonna do it here. This function gets called when the NPC has already gone out of the screen, and that gives the player the longest break. Alright, now to test this, let's go in the NPC manager, and I'm gonna add a context menu attribute in here to call this function. Finally, let's go to Unity, and let's make a new dialog. You can see that the text area attribute here gives us more space to the string lines, and I'll simply put an ABC kind of dialog. Now let's go in the game manager, and let's add this test dialog to the reference. Also, in case you have set the preferences to have players not interact with other players, make sure the layer of the NPC is set to default. But anyway, let's test our NPC manager. Now we're playing normally, we are spawning entities. But if I click on the NPC manager and activate the function, here comes the NPC, and you can see that there are no other enemies behind it, and I can click on the dialog box, and when it's ended, it resumes, and the entities start spawning again. Perfect. Except that I've lost. Alright, now you just need a way to load a certain dialog rather than another. To do that, let's make a new class that's gonna be a magazine for all our dialogues. And I'm gonna add it to the game manager. In here, let's make an array of dialogues. And let's make a function that returns a dialogue. As you can see, I've also added a string parameter. That is because we're gonna load all the dialogues based on another value that we're gonna make. In the SNPC dialog, let's make a new serialized field string for a dialog name. We also need to add a get property to get it from the dialog magazine. And that's it. Now back to the magazine. We use array.find to return the correct dialog. I'm also going to throw a debug log error in case we don't find anything. Perfect. Now let's also make a singleton of this script. And now, thanks to this function, we can now load whatever dialog we want that is in our assets and activate the NPC. Let's go back to the NPC manager. And in here, to activate NPC, let's add a new parameter for a dialog. And we simply set the current dialog to the parameter. And we also have to remove the context menu attribute. Alright, now if we want to activate the NPC, we simply call the NPC manager, and as a parameter, we give something from the dialogs magazine. Let's do that in practice by going in the unlock enemies manager script. In here we call different events based on how far the player has gone. So let's just add a new event. And in here let's say I want to activate an NPC with a dialog named test. And that's it. It's only one line and we do everything. Now we just need to go back to Unity, and in our test dialog we add test as the name. And in our game manager, in the NPC dialogs magazine, we add this new script level object. The current dialog reference that we have here in the NPC manager, we could remove that, so let's do that. Everything is set up, so let's test it. Alright, you can see that I'm playing normally, everything is spawning correctly, but after a while, no more obstacles. And here is our NPC, and it's gonna start a dialogue. We can touch to continue, and when it ends, it goes right past us, and after a while, the entity starts spawning again. Perfect. Now the NPC seemed a bit rushed, so I'm actually gonna increase the starting position to say 9, so it feels like there's more of a break. It felt like it was just another enemy. And another thing that we could do is in the NPC dialogs magazine, instead of making all the references by hand, by doing this, we could make a folder in our assets and tell NPC Dialogues magazine to open that folder and grab all the scriptable objects in there and put them in an array. That's what I do usually when I'm dealing with a lot of scriptable objects. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you want to make another dialogue, you can just make a new scriptable object. It's really simple. And if you want to load a certain dialogue, you've seen that it's only one function, one line of code, and you can call it from everywhere and anywhere in the game. This video is already pretty long, so I'm going to cut it right here, but in the next video we're going to see how to customize these dialogue events. So instead of just showing a text, we also give the player some money, or we show an animation, stuff like that. Alright, so that's it for this video, and if you had any doubts about the code or any suggestions about the next topic, do let me know in the comments. If you want to download my entire project, I have a link in the description with a GitHub repository. And if you like this content, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.